the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Sumiyoshi-kai, and the Inagawa-kai. For several decades now, these three gangs have defined Japan's criminal underworld as the so-called Big Three of the Yakuza. In past videos, we followed the Yamaguchi-gumi born in Kobe as it rose to dominate the Japanese underworld by the 1960s. We've seen the Inagawa-kai emerge from post-war Tokyo, its second-generation leader becoming arguably the richest gangster in Japanese history, embodying the image of Yakuza as businessmen. But what about the Sumiyoshi-kai? How did this Tokyo-based gang rise to stand toe-to-toe with the Yamaguchi-gumi and surpass the Inagawa-kai in influence? For starters, as the biggest gang in the capital, the Sumiyoshi-kai represents the dominant Yakuza force in eastern Japan, and it is also technically by far the oldest of the big three, its roots stretching back to a time when samurai and shoguns had only just lost their grip on Japan. Add to that a one-of-a-kind organizational structure, a tangled web of alliances, rivalries, and street wars, and what you've got here is a syndicate unlike any other. If exploring more than 150 years of a Yakuza gang's history sounds good to you, then you came to the right place. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you think I did a good job of explaining things. But without further ado, this is the story of the Sumiyoshi-kai, the rise of Tokyo's biggest gang. The origins of the Sumiyoshi-kai are wrapped in a mix of fact and a tiny little dash of Yakuza folklore. Ask 10 people, and you might hear 10 slightly different versions. But most agree on one thing: the group can be traced back to one man, a gambler from early Meiji-era Tokyo. Ito Matsugoro, born in 1846, was a man in his prime when he gathered a crew of gamblers and staked his claim on the Shibaura district of Tokyo. He called this crew the Sumiyoshi-ika, or the Sumiyoshi family, the name paying homage to his own birthplace of Sumiyoshi-cho, which is a neighborhood built on the former site of Tokyo's famous Yoshiwara red light district. This was once the largest pleasure quarter in all of Japan, so kinda makes sense for a high-profile gambler to be born here. The early decades of Ito Matsugoro's Sumiyoshi-ika, those are barely documented, but we do know at least a little bit. Around 1918, leadership of the group was handed over to a certain Kuramochi Naokichi, a Yokohama dock worker who ended up steering the group through World War II. It was a tough time to be the leader of a group of gamblers. The war had left Tokyo in ruins, occupied by American forces. But at the same time, the door to the city's profitable criminal underworld was suddenly left wide open. Dozens, if not hundreds of gangs scrambled for control in the capital. But it was under Abe Chusaku, who became the third-generation boss of the Sumiyoshi-ika in 1948, that the family of gamblers truly started to expand beyond just gambling and began transforming into an actual Yakuza outfit. First came the western part of Tokyo's Ginza district, where the Sumiyoshi-ika moved into protection rackets, shaking down bars, restaurants, and dance halls. Classic occupation-era Yakuza stuff, really? I mean, basically, it was either that or the black markets. But it was also here that the Sumiyoshi-ika developed its very first serious rivalry, with none other than the Tosei-kai, led by the fearsome Machi Hisayuki. Much like the Sumiyoshi leadership, Machi saw Ginza's potential, and not just in extorting local establishments, but also in terms of cutting deals with American GIs, some of which were more than willing to do business with whichever gang controlled the area. Inevitably, the two sides clashed over turf in western Ginza, because that's how rivaling gangs like to do things. But what's wild is that during much of the early occupation era, the Sumiyoshi-ika and the Tosei-kai weren't just challenging their natural enemy, the police. But because law enforcement in Tokyo had been so severely weakened following the war, they were more numerous and also better armed than the actual Tokyo Metropolitan Police. At least for a while. And that's also what earned both gangs, the Tose-kai and the Ginza faction of the Sumiyoshi-ika, a pretty telling nickname: Ginza Keisatsu, or Ginza Police. Their battle for Ginza continued throughout the early 1950s, though the Sumiyoshi faction there was dealt some pretty heavy blows in the process, suffering mass arrests at the hands of the American occupation in both 1950 and 1954. In the end, the Tose-kai came out on top in Ginza, but instead of walking away from the feud entirely, both gangs simply shifted their rivalry a few blocks over to the Roppongi and Akasaka districts, areas that were just as promising, if not even more so. Generally, Tokyo in the 1950s was a city in rapid recovery, expanding into something bigger and wealthier than ever before. And in a way, the Sumiyoshi family mirrored that same hunger for growth. The 1950s were also a wild decade for the Yakuza in general. By 1951, Japan counted around 51,000 gangsters nationwide. Nothing to sneeze at, but by the end of the decade, that number had nearly quadrupled. Crime in Japan was becoming more competitive than ever, and to make it to the top or to survive there, you had to be not just ruthless, but also inventive. And so, Abe Chusaku, the Sumiyoshi family's third-generation leader, decided to try something a bit different. In 1958, a full decade into his tenure, he united 28 different groups from across eastern Japan, gamblers, gangsters, and street thugs alike, into one massive federation, and called it Minato-kai. Abe then stepped down in 1962, handing leadership to the family's fourth-generation boss, Sekigami Yoshimitsu, and then in 1964, under Sekigami's watch, the Minato-kai Federation adopted a new name, one that tied it directly back to its origins. Because from that point forward, it was known as the Sumiyoshi-kai, or Sumiyoshi Association. Now, I know, this is where things get a little bit confusing, but bear with me. The Sumiyoshi-ika and the Sumiyoshi-kai, not the same thing. Not really. The Sumiyoshi-ika is the original family. You know, the mothership of gamblers founded by Ito Matsugoro all those years back. The Sumiyoshi-kai, on the other hand, that is the larger federation that formed around that family, made up of dozens of allied gangs. The Sumiyoshi-ika, the family, always held a special place inside this federation, and its leaders often did have outsized influence. But unlike most other gangs, say for example the Yamaguchi-gumi, where the godfather sits at the top of a strict hierarchical pyramid, the Sumiyoshi system is much looser in a sense. Actually, let's stick with the Yamaguchi-gumi as an example. The Yamaguchi-gumi is, let's call it a vertical empire. Again, picture a pyramid. At the very top sits the Oyabun, the godfather. Orders flow down, respect and money flows up. Each layer of underbosses owes everything to the man above them, and the chain of command is basically absolute. The Sumiyoshi-kai, by contrast, is, well, it's a federation. Imagine a round table rather than a pyramid. Each major faction retains its independence and its own turf. Together, they choose a president, but that president acts more like a chairman or mediator rather than a dictator. He's there to settle disputes, represent the federation as a whole, and coordinate when necessary. But the local bosses, those still run their operations on their own terms. Oh, and here's another wrinkle, because of course there is one. The leader of the Sumiyoshi-ika and the leader of the Sumiyoshi-kai are often, but not always, the same person. Sometimes the mothership's boss sits in both chairs, but other times the Federation elects a different president to handle the bigger picture stuff. Confusing? Yep, classic Sumiyoshi-kai. However, all of this is part of what makes the Sumiyoshi-kai so unique in the first place. It isn't a single monolithic empire like the Yamaguchi-gumi, but rather a confederation of semi-independent gangs bound together under the Sumiyoshi-kai banner and with the Sumiyoshi-ika at the core of it all. On one hand, this might make them less unified, prone to internal rivalries, and sometimes messy to manage. But on the other hand, it also makes them flexible, resilient, and incredibly difficult to stamp out entirely. Or, well, at least in theory, that is. As the Sumiyoshi-kai expanded across Tokyo and the wider Kanto plain that surrounded the capital, their rise caught the eye of none other than Kodama Yoshio, suspected war criminal, right-wing ultranationalist, and perhaps the single most influential connection between Japanese politics and the post-war Yakuza. In December 1963, Kodama launched the Kanto-kai, basically a super association that attempted to unite Eastern Japan's biggest gangs under one umbrella. Think of it as Japan's answer to the Mafia's commission over in America, a council of bosses meant to keep the peace and share the influence. The Sumiyoshi-kai were part of this super association too, and at least for a brief moment, Japan's criminal East looked ready to rival the Yamaguchi-gumi's dominance over in the West. At its peak, the Kanto-kai claimed some 13,000 gangsters under its umbrella, a number that matched, if not even surpassed, the Yamaguchi-gumis. All things considered, it was looking pretty good for the Sumiyoshi-kai. Membership was booming, alliances were strong, and they held a rather influential seat at the big Yakuza table. But then came the curveball, the 1964 Tokyo Olympics. For Japan back in the early 1960s, hosting the games was more than just a sporting event. It was the nation's first chance to reintroduce itself to the world 2 decades after being one of the main villains of World War II. Obviously, the last thing the government wanted was foreign visitors and journalists stumbling across mobsters on every Tokyo street corner. By the early 1960s, Japan was home to an estimated 184,000 Yakuza members, and violent incidents tied to them were skyrocketing. Stabbings, shootings, turf wars, you name it. It was happening with alarming regularity. And now, with the 1964 Tokyo Olympics on the horizon, Japan's first chance to show the world that it had left the chaos and violence of the war years behind, the government wasn't about to let the Yakuza steal the spotlight. So in February of 1964, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police, together with prefectural police forces, launched one of the most aggressive anti-Yakuza campaigns in Japanese history. They called it Daiichi Chocho Sakusen, or Operation First Summit. The mission was simple: identify and target the 10 largest syndicates in the country and make an example out of them. And among all the big names included on that list, the group that got hit the hardest was the Sumiyoshi-kai. In June of 1964, their 4th generation boss, Sekigami Yoshimitsu, was arrested on gambling charges, effectively cutting the head off the organization. But that wasn't all. The rank and file was gutted too, with more than 1,000 members thrown behind bars in one fell swoop. Here's the question though. Why the Sumiyoshi-kai specifically? They were powerful, sure, but not the only major player in the capital. The Inagawa-kai, for example, had just muscled its way into Tokyo a few years prior and also controlled the Yokohama and the Yokosuka docks just south of the capital. At the time, they were arguably just as influential, if not even more so. So, why were the Sumiyoshi hit harder than anyone else? Well, there's one specific event from late 1963 that might be able to explain it. The murder of Rikido-san. Rikido-san, this guy wasn't just a wrestler, he was one of the biggest celebrities in Japan, a national icon beloved by kids and adults alike. But he was also famously hot-tempered and had well-known ties to the Underworld. On December 8th, 1963, Rikido-san was out partying at the New Latin Quarter nightclub in Akasaka. Remember, a territory that at the time was contested between the Tosei-kai and the Sumiyoshi-kai. At some point that evening, he got into an argument with another man. Accounts differ. Some say it started with a stepped-on foot. But tempers flared, a fight broke out, and Rikido-san was stabbed in the abdomen and died from his injuries a week later. The man who stabbed him? Murata Katsushi, a member of the Dai Nippon Kogyo, a faction within, you guessed it, the Sumiyoshi-kai. Now, was this the direct reason the police came down hardest on them during Operation First Summit? We'll never know for sure, but it kinda makes sense. Crippling the gang tied to the death of Japan's most beloved athlete just months before the Olympics was not only a logical move from a law enforcement standpoint, but also great optics for a government desperate to show the world it had its act together. Either way, the fallout was devastating for the Sumiyoshi-kai. With over 1,000 members and their top boss behind bars, the Kanto-kai Super Federation they were a part of also collapsed in January of 1965. And 4 months after that, in May of 1965, the Sumiyoshi-kai itself was dissolved. The old Sumiyoshi family, the original core group, remained, but the larger federation surrounding it was gone. It could have ended right then and there. The Sumiyoshi name could have quietly faded into history. But this is the Sumiyoshi-kai we're talking about. After the death of their 4th generation leader in late 1967, leadership passed to Hori Masao, the family's 5th generation boss. And Hori, he wasted no time. By 1969, he had revived the federation, and because at this point it was practically a tradition, had given it a brand new name, Sumiyoshi-rengo, or Sumiyoshi Alliance. Not the last time they'd rebrand themselves either, by the way, so yeah. Again, bear with me. The Sumiyoshi-ika and the newly rebranded Sumiyoshi-rengo marched into the 1970s, a decade that would reshape the Yakuza world in all kinds of ways. If the 60s were defined by crackdowns and reorganization, then the 70s were all about one thing: alliances. In October of 1972, after nearly a decade of East versus West tensions and petty differences, 2 of the country's biggest Yakuza titans finally shook hands. Or exchanged the sake cups, I should say. In the western corner, you had the unstoppable Yamaguchi-gumi, and in the east, the powerful Inagawa-kai. They were packed and created one of the most dominant underworld alliances Japan had ever seen. To put it in perspective, between these 2 forces, only 4 prefectures in the entire country now remain completely untouched by their alliance. And there's more, because just 4 days earlier, the Sumiyoshi-rengo had made a major move of its own. Alongside 8 other Kanto-based gangs, including the Inagawa-kai and even their old rivals, the Tosei-kai, they formed a new, let's call it a friendship association. The Hatsuka-kai, named after the date of its founding on October 20th. This association, it was nothing like what Kodama Yoshio attempted to build a decade prior with the Kanto-kai. It was simply there to promote good relations between the largest gangs in eastern Japan. But nonetheless, this was a rather valuable alliance to be a part of, one that actually still exists to this day. The Sumiyoshi weren't just busy making friends though, they were also expanding. Between 1969 and the late 1980s, under the leadership of 5th generation boss Hori Masao, at least 5 new organizations and their families joined the federation, stretching Sumiyoshi influence from Tokyo all the way up to Hokkaido. And by the mid-1980s, they were close to 7,000 members strong, pulling in an estimated $276 million a year from their many business ventures, and even going international. Case in point, Hawaii. The Japanese love Hawaii, and the Yakuza are no exception. In May of 1976, a Sumiyoshi member named Wataru Jackson Inada was found murdered in his Honolulu apartment. Investigators soon discovered he'd been working as a Yakuza representative in Hawaii since at least 1972. His death, reportedly tied to a drug deal gone wrong with West Coast mafiosi, showed that the Sumiyoshi weren't just dabbling abroad, they already had a well-established drug pipeline running through Hawaii onto the US mainland. And Inada wasn't the only one. Another Sumiyoshi man, Takagi Takeshi, was also active there at around the same time, rubbing shoulders with some of the shadiest operators on the islands. Meanwhile, back home in Japan, the Sumiyoshi-rengo was keeping plenty busy with all kinds of beef. Between 1978 and 1983, they kept on clashing with a faction of the Kyoku Tokai in Shinjuku. Then in 1989, things escalated again when they went to war with the Fukushima-based Yori family, a conflict that saw 5 shootings in the span of just 1 week. And of course, all that wasn't happening in a vacuum either. All these skirmishes coincided with other major gang wars of the time, like the infamous Yamaichi War. And together, they painted a picture of just how absolutely out of control Yakuza violence had become by the end of the 1980s. So of course, what came next was that big government crackdown on Japanese organized crime in the early 1990s with the introduction of the infamous anti-Boryokudan laws, which would gradually reshape the Yakuza landscape over the next 3+ decades. But what did that mean for the Sumiyoshi-kai specifically? Well, first off, they had to change their name again. Naturally. We actually skipped one name change earlier, in 1982, when the Sumiyoshi-rengo, formerly the Sumiyoshi-kai, became the Sumiyoshi-rengo-kai. Yeah, I know. Then in 1991, someone probably said enough with this Rengo-kai BS and switched it back to plain old Sumiyoshi-kai. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the last time the organization ever changed its name. Thank goodness. And that final name change, it also marked the start of a new chapter in Sumiyoshi history. In October of 1990, the 5th generation boss passed away, making way for Nishiguchi Shigeo to take the reins. By this point, the Sumiyoshi-kai had surpassed the Inagawa-kai to become the biggest gang in Tokyo and all of eastern Japan. It was a prime position to be in, because the anti-Yakuza laws that were about to roll out, and which were supposed to cripple organized crime. Those actually ended up benefiting the largest syndicates, at least initially. Here's the thing, the law mostly wiped out the smaller gangs. The big players, like the Sumiyoshi-kai, they had the cash and manpower to adapt, to set up front companies to sidestep most of the new restrictions. This was especially easy for the large syndicates in eastern Japan, which had already been conducting business with the help of front companies for a while at that point. For them, the new laws were more of a nuisance than a real threat. A bureaucratic annoyance, if you will. Basically, they just swapped out titles like Oyabun for president or manager, and kept rolling. In other words, the initial version of the anti-Yakuza laws from the early 1990s ended up consolidating the power of the Big Three. Actually, let's put that into numbers. According to the National Police Agency in Japan, in 1990, the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Sumiyoshi-kai, and the Inagawa-kai together counted 42,700 total members, making up just over 48% of all Yakuza nationwide at that time. Fast forward 18 years, and even though the overall Yakuza population had slightly declined at that point, the Big Three now made up more than 72% of the total, with a combined 60,000 members. Fast forward to today, and the Yakuza landscape has shifted dramatically once again, with new forms of crime like the Tokuryu cybercriminals gradually replacing the old model of pledging total allegiance to middle-aged men in suits. By the end of 2024, the total number of Yakuza members across Japan had dipped below 20,000 for the first time since records began in the 1950s, with around 18,800 tattooed gangsters still roaming the streets currently. The Sumiyoshi-kai wasn't immune to this decline, counting just over 3,000 members and associates. That still makes them the largest Yakuza organization in Tokyo, but it's a far cry from the 7,000-strong force they commanded in the mid-1980s. Their influence abroad might have taken a couple of hits too. As recently as 2012, the Obama administration officially recognized the Sumiyoshi-kai as a transnational criminal threat by placing the organization and its leaders on a sanctions list for activities including weapons and human trafficking, fraud, and money laundering in the United States. But even if their international operations have been curtailed, and even if their numbers have shrunk, the gang's presence in Tokyo itself hasn't vanished. I mean, there is still over 3,000 of them, which is not an insignificant number. Sumiyoshi-kai may no longer dominate the capital the way they once did. They may not be as obvious about their crimes as they had been in the past. But the legacy of their power and their network of influence still lurk beneath Tokyo and its many businesses and establishments. And even in decline, the organization's reach surely continues to shape the capital of Japan in subtle but enduring ways. And that's it for today. All that's left to do now is to shout out my Patreon supporters listed here, including The Hockey Gentleman, Khalid Lepta, Xowiabu, Javier Soravia, Steve Matsui, Turam, RK0, Sierran DC, White Gilden, Justin Down, Yokuru Space Whale, Cats and Soup, Chart B-Man, Ben Harradine, Metal Mama, T-Bird, Tom Ericus Prime, and Boo Boo Cakes. And to everyone else who decided to tune in this time, thank you so much for watching. Sayonara.